That was beautiful. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I had reason this past weekend to remember the time I got hit by a car as a pedestrian that was going about 25 miles per hour at the time when it hit me. That was 14 years ago, this past Memorial Day weekend. This is the number one way people in New York City get hit by cars. Cars is rushing on oncoming traffic, making a left-hand turn, and the driver saw the crowd of pedestrians behind me and didn't see me. I got hit. I lived, obviously. I was thrown about 10 or 15 feet and luckily ended on my bottom and not my head, or it would have been a very different experience. My doctor told me that I was really quite lucky. My body decided on its own to remain relaxed as I was hit and thrown. If I had tensed up, she said, the injury would have been far worse. Now, the body is an interesting creature. With adrenaline going, I was able to leave that accident and walk a mile to a friend's house. The next morning, however, I could barely hobble along to see my doctor 3 blocks away. It would take about 2 weeks before I could safely navigate a sidewalk with a leg brace and a crutch, and about 3 months before I could walk again unaided. And that was just cartilage and ligament damage. Amazingly, no bones were broken. Apparently, broken bones hurt more, but heal faster, the doctor told me. Trauma stays in the body, hidden away till something reminds you that it's still there. For a couple of years, I couldn't even go in a car. Even though I was a pedestrian in that accident, my mind associated cars with danger. I've unlearned most of the fears associated with now, after 14 years, but I will still stop any friends with me from crossing a street against a light. Not that I was jaywalking when I was hit, but I still have a visceral reaction at wide crosswalks. And my other fellow New Yorkers are amazed that I don't jaywalk anymore. A few years ago, I had a near repeat of this story, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but I'm thinking about this week because it nearly happened again this Thursday, this time on a Montclair sidewalk, of all places. By the difference of no more than 6 inches, I avoided an exact same repeat of 14 years ago being hit by a car as a pedestrian, also in Brooklyn. The driver was same thing, rushing on coming traffic and making a left-hand turn into my path in the crosswalk. And trauma is a fickle beast, and muscle memory can flash back in a moment. Everything hurt again, even though I was not touched at all by the car. That time, probably because of my visceral response to crosswalks, I was able to stop right before the car hit me. And don't get me wrong, not being hit by a car is preferable to being hit by a car. But within 15 minutes, I began having a mixture of phantom echoes of the serious accident. Every muscle from my leg to my neck tensed up, and for a week or two, it was still painful just sitting or standing. Trauma, surrender, and letting go. All too often in the world of spirituality and consumerist self-help, we use these words blithely, like it's an easy thing to achieve. Trauma is a serious thing, and again, sometimes quite fickle in what will bring it screaming again to the surface. In general, I go about my life not really thinking about the accident, and then there are moments where I'm reliving it, physically. Acclaimed author Octavia Butler writes, and it's essentially the title of today's sermon, all that we touch changes, and what we change changes you. Whether we find ourselves facing the oncoming rush of what's next in life, able to roll with it or able to avoid it, we're always changing it, and we're always changed by it. Today's service reflects on the theology of Octavia Butler, and I'll tell you a little bit about her for those who are unfamiliar. She was an African-American science fiction writer, well, probably more speculative fiction, a multiple recipient of both the Hugo and Nebula Awards, And in 1995, she became the first science fiction writer to receive a MacArthur Fellowship. Her near-future science fiction writing presciently explored worlds eerily like our own. The excerpts I'm quoting today all come from her 1993 series that began with The Parable of the Sower. 30 years ago, and this still stuns me, she wrote a book that was set around the time we are now in, or maybe 10 years later at most, but not much later than that. It was an America that was facing rampant forest fires due to climate change on the West Coast, the increasing failure of agricultural production, the breakdown of suburban communities, and the breakdown of the basic rule of law. Instead of a fake crisis with our southern border, we were enmeshed in a military conflict with our northern border. And I kid you not, the next thing I'm going to say is 100% true. In her story, a faux religious president campaigned on the political motto, "Make America Great Again," 30 years ago. I don't recommend it for an enjoyable read, and there's some content warnings around violence in it, but it is gripping and thought-provoking. And if we're going to discuss the virtues of letting go and surrender, I wanted to first begin with the understanding of what that might mean in the face of the reality of trauma, to move beyond the personal. Xenophobia is trauma, climate change is trauma, separate but equal is trauma, and none of that is science fiction. It's the world we live in. And although the worst of climate change is a contemporary reality, the other traumas I just mentioned have been threats since the dawn of civilization. Trauma finds its way into our bones and our muscles, and even after being healed, can still find its way out again and again. Octavia Butler takes a hard look at the spiritual and social impact of change. Change, the hardest spiritual truth. When communities slowly adjust to the times, we can get in the habit of critiquing anything different by labeling it change, as if that in itself makes it bad or wrong, even if the change is slow coming, well thought out and well discussed. It's the universal buzzword to end all debate, the worst four-letter word, so to speak, change. Butler's writings is as much theology as it is science fiction. Without ruining the plot, I want to share a little of her theology that I find translates universally to be true. Here are 4 short points I'll share, and then I'll talk about each of them in turn. 1, all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. 2, there is no end to what a living world will demand of you. 3, we'll adapt. We have to. God has changed. Strange how much it helps me to remember that. And 4, drowning people sometimes die fighting the rescuers. The first quote, all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. Some of us are most familiar with this teaching in the Buddhist context, where our attachment to things not changing only leads to suffering, since all things change. An attachment to what cannot be is painful. The Serenity Prayer is a more modern version of this spiritual lesson. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. There are things we can change, things we can affect in our lives, and there are many things that we simply cannot. Pain and hope, to face each of them as they come, is one of the hardest lessons. But for Butler, she's looking at this message a little differently. Change for her is sometimes like a rock banging against an object. All that you touch, you change, right? The rock can break another rock or a window or maybe a door, but the rock will probably also break, at least a little itself, as it comes up against what it changes. A fragment might fall off, break off. Changes always happen in relationship. It's never isolated. That's probably part of the reason that I feel so difficult in communities like ours here, because all the relationships are even more pronounced and obvious. It can feel like the change is compounding upon itself, that every little thing can begin to point us toward the biggest changes of our life, our own end. We all feel that worry at some time in our lives, and trauma, any form of trauma, moves that fear to the forefront. The next two theological quotes speak for themselves, I think. There's no end to what a living world will demand of you, yet we often act surprised that the demands of a living world come again and again. And we'll adapt. We have to. God has changed. But Butler poignantly teaches us that strange how much it helps us to remember that. We can catch ourselves always focused on the worst or on the end that the changes bring, but there's a deeper spirituality found in the practice of remembering that change is at the very foundation of our being. We can forget that we come into this world in an act of tremendous change with the cry of our baby voice, that all that is and will ever be comes from change. It's also our birthright, and there's a solace we can find in what we open ourselves to that truth. I'm going to tell a short Buddhist parable or folktale that fits here. There's a beautiful sunny day. In the oceans, the waves are moving, and there's a point where one droplet of water, the crest of the wave, catches the sun in the most perfect way, and it wonders to itself, this is perfection. I don't want to lose this. And it holds onto that beauty. But if it doesn't let go, the wave will not continue. And so it has to. And it's a teaching about, in our life, how do we be present to the beauty when it happens, and letting go, allowing ourselves to be what our purpose is. A wave is not a wave if it's not moving. This is the virtue in surrender sometimes, in letting go. It's not about giving up, but in recognizing that change is part of our nature, to let go of that which can never be, is to face our own world and our own situation as it is. Amen, and blessed be. And I invite you all to rise in body or in spirit and sing hymn number 34, Though I May Speak with Bravest Fire.